Welcome back, history lovers. Tonight, we're going to walk through 6 earthquakes that happened before anyone on Earth understood what an earthquake was, and in every single one of them, the shaking was not what killed most of the people. Let me say that again, because it is the thread that runs through this entire story. The ground moved, walls fell, and then, in the hours and days and weeks that followed, something else arrived. Fire, water, cold, hunger, suspicion. In some of these cities, more people died in the month after the earthquake than died during it. In at least one of them, the earthquake killed a few thousand, and the aftermath killed a civilization's worth of trust in its own neighbours. Aleppo. In the year 1138, Lincoln, in England, 1185, Crete, 1303, Friuli, in what is now northern Italy and southern Austria, 1348, Basel, Switzerland, 1356, and Kamakura, Japan, 1498, 6 events, spread across 3.5 centuries and half the known world, and every one of them ends the same way. The survivors crawl out of the rubble, look around and discover that the worst is still ahead of them. Before we begin, if you enjoy what we do here, hit like and subscribe so you do not miss the rest of this series. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight, because I want to know how far this story travels. And here is the question I want you to hold on to while we go. If the ground opened under your city tomorrow, what would actually kill you? The stones, or everything that comes after the stones? Let's get into it. Part 1. The problem with medieval numbers. Before we touch a single one of these disasters, I need to be honest with you about something, because if I am not, everything that follows becomes a kind of lie by omission. The death tolls you will read for medieval earthquakes are, in most cases, not measurements. They are impressions. There was no census. There was no coroner. There was no agency counting bodies and filing a report. What there was, in most cases, was a chronicler, often a monk, often writing decades later, often working from a story told to him by someone who heard it from someone else, trying to convey to a reader who had never seen such a thing what it had felt like when the world came apart. And when you are trying to convey the scale of something incomprehensible, you reach for a big number, not because you are lying, because you are reaching. So when you see the figure that is most often attached to the Aleppo earthquake of 1138, 230,000 dead, a number that puts it in the top handful of deadliest earthquakes in all of recorded human history, I want you to hold that number loosely. Modern seismologists and historians who have gone back through the Arabic sources believe that figure is almost certainly the result of a scribal collision. A later chronicler appears to have merged the Aleppo event with a completely different catastrophe that struck the city of Ganja in what is now Azerbaijan roughly a year later. And the two disasters fused into one impossible number that then got copied forward for 800 years. The real toll at Aleppo was probably in the low thousands, which sounds like a correction that makes the story smaller. It does not, it makes it worse. And I will show you exactly why. Part 2. Aleppo, the 11th of October 1138. Picture northern Syria in the autumn of 1138. This is a landscape that has been at war continuously for 4 decades. The First Crusade came through here in the 1090s and left behind a lattice of Christian and Muslim fortresses staring at each other across 40 miles of farmland. Every hilltop that matters has a fortress on it. Every fortress has a garrison. Every garrison has spent years reinforcing walls, thickening towers, stacking stone on stone on stone until the structure could survive a siege engine. Aleppo itself sits at the northern end of the Dead Sea Transform, a strike-slip fault system that runs like a seam up the eastern Mediterranean, separating the Arabian plate from the African plate. The two plates are grinding past each other at roughly half a centimetre a year. That sounds like nothing. Over a human lifetime it is a few feet. Over the centuries between major ruptures, it is enough stored elastic strain to shatter a province. Nobody in Aleppo in 1138 knew any of that. What they knew was that the ground had trembled before in the memory of grandfathers, and that it would presumably tremble again, and that this was one of the many things God did that men did not explain. The shaking began, according to the Arabic sources, in the second week of October. And here is the first thing that made this catastrophe different. It did not arrive as a single event. It arrived as a sequence. The sources describe a series of shocks over several days, which means many buildings were already cracked, already leaning, already compromised, when the largest shock arrived and finished them. This is a pattern we will see again and again tonight, so let me name it now. A single violent earthquake is survivable for a well-built stone structure. What kills stone architecture is repetition. The first shock opens the mortar joints. The second shock lets the walls move independently. The third shock finds a building that is no longer a building, it is a stack. The citadel of Aleppo, that enormous fortified mound at the centre of the city that still dominates the skyline today, is described as having partially collapsed. Sections of the city walls came down, but the truly horrifying detail is not in Aleppo at all. It is in the fortresses outside it. At Harim, a Crusader stronghold roughly 25 miles west, the fortifications collapsed and the garrison fled. At Atharib, another Crusader position, the walls and the citadel came down, and the sources describe hundreds of the garrison being crushed. At Zaradna, a Muslim-held fortress, the story is the same. Walls into rubble, defenders under them, and here is why that matters so much more than the raw number of dead. Every one of those fortresses was in a state of armed standoff with the fortress on the next hill. When your walls collapse and your neighbour's walls do not, you have not just suffered a natural disaster, you have suffered a strategic catastrophe. You are now a garrison of frightened men standing in a pile of your own defences, in full view of an enemy who has spent 4 decades waiting for exactly this. The shaking was the beginning, it was never the end. What followed the Aleppo earthquake was not primarily a rescue operation, it was a scramble. Imad ad-Din Zengi, the Turkic warlord who controlled Aleppo and Mosul, and who is one of the most consequential figures of the entire crusading period, understood immediately what the earthquake had handed him. Fortresses that had taken years to build had become in 90 seconds undefended piles of cut stone. The men inside them were injured, leaderless and cut off. The roads were blocked, nobody's reinforcements were coming, and so the response to the disaster, on both sides, was to move on each other's ruins. Think about what that means for a civilian in a village between those fortresses. Your house has collapsed, your grain stores are buried, your well may be fouled or dry. Because earthquakes routinely rearrange groundwater, that is one of the most consistently reported side effects in pre-modern accounts. Springs that stop and springs that suddenly start. Your local lord's castle, the place you would flee to for protection, is a hill of rubble, and now armed men are moving through the district taking advantage of the situation. You did not die in the earthquake. You are going to die of what the earthquake made possible. Part 3. What actually kills people when a medieval city falls? I want to slow down here and be specific, because I think the popular image of an earthquake, the ground splitting open, the dramatic chasm, people falling in, is almost entirely wrong, and it obscures the real mechanisms. Ground does not usually swallow people. What kills people is the material we choose to live inside. Medieval urban construction across most of Europe and the Middle East falls into a small number of categories, and each one fails in its own particular, predictable, horrible way. The first is unreinforced masonry. Stone or brick, held together with lime mortar, sometimes with nothing but gravity and friction. This material is enormously strong in compression. You can stack it very high and it will happily bear the weight. It is close to useless in tension and shear. Earthquakes do not push down on buildings, they shake them sideways. So a wall that could carry a cathedral roof forever simply peels apart when the ground moves horizontally beneath it and comes down in blocks that weigh as much as a person. The second is rubble core construction, which is even worse. 2 thin skins of dressed stone with a fill of loose rubble and mortar between them. It looks like a solid wall. Structurally, it is a sandwich. Under lateral shaking, the 2 faces separate from the core, and the entire thing disembowels itself outward into the street. The third is heavy roofing over light framing. Stone tile, thick timber, sometimes packed earth, sitting on top of walls that are not tied to it in any meaningful way. When the walls move and the roof does not, the roof comes down as a single unit onto whoever is beneath it. And the fourth, which becomes the entire story in Basel 200 years later, is timber and thatch packed at a density that would horrify any modern fire marshal, threaded through with open hearths and oil lamps and workshop furnaces. In a city where the streets are narrow enough that a man can touch the buildings on both sides. Hold that last one in your mind. We are going to come back to it, and when we do, you will understand why the citizens of one Swiss city survived the largest earthquake in the recorded history of Central Europe, and then watched their entire world burn anyway. Now I want to take you somewhere that has no business being in a story about earthquakes at all. England, Lincolnshire, a gently rolling landscape of chalk and limestone, sheep pasture and marsh, sitting on some of the most tectonically boring crust on the face of the planet. Britain is nowhere near a plate boundary. It sits comfortably in the middle of the Eurasian plate, hundreds of miles from anywhere the Earth is actively tearing itself apart. If you were designing a place to live where the ground would never betray you, you could do considerably worse than medieval England. And on a Sunday in April of 1185, the ground betrayed England anyway. The chroniclers who recorded it, and there are several, which is unusual and important, describe it in language that borders on apocalyptic. Roger of Howden, one of the more reliable English chroniclers of the period, wrote about an earthquake unlike anything in living memory. Stones splitting, houses collapsing, the ground itself seeming to rise. Other accounts describe it as being felt across a huge area of the country. Some describe the sound, which is a detail I always look for in pre-modern accounts because it tells you the witness was actually there. Earthquakes make a noise before they arrive, a low approaching roar, often mistaken for wagons or wind or an army. The most famous casualty of the 1185 event was Lincoln Cathedral, and I need you to understand what Lincoln Cathedral was in 1185 to understand what its destruction meant. This was not a village church. Lincoln sits on a steep limestone ridge above the surrounding plain, and the cathedral sat at the very top of that ridge, visible for miles in every direction across flat countryside. It had been begun a century earlier by Bishop Remigius, the first Norman bishop of the diocese, as an explicit statement of Norman power over a recently conquered Anglo-Saxon population. It was rebuilt and expanded after a fire in the previous century. It was, by the standards of its moment, one of the great buildings of the kingdom, a massive Romanesque structure of thick walls, round arches and small windows, the architectural language of weight and permanence. And in 1185, it fell. The chronicle accounts describe the cathedral being split, rent apart, essentially destroyed as a functioning building. What survived, and what you can still stand in front of today if you go to Lincoln, is the lower portion of the west front, that immense fortress-like screen of stone with its deep recessed arches, which is genuinely one of the strangest and most powerful pieces of architecture in England, precisely because it is a Romanesque survivor grafted onto a Gothic building that came after. Because here is what happened next, and this is where the Lincoln story becomes something more interesting than a catalogue of damage. The destruction of Lincoln Cathedral was one of the direct catalysts for the introduction of full Gothic architecture into England. Let me explain why that is not a coincidence. The bishop appointed to Lincoln in the wake of the disaster was Hugh of Avalon, later Saint Hugh of Lincoln, a Burgundian Carthusian monk of formidable reputation, brought to England by King Henry II. Hugh arrived to find his cathedral in ruins and made the decision that would define his episcopate. He would not repair it. He would rebuild it in the new style coming out of northern France. That new style is what we now call Gothic, and the crucial thing about it for our purposes tonight is that it is not primarily a decorative movement, it is a structural revolution. The pointed arch, the ribbed vault, and the flying buttress together solve a problem that Romanesque builders could only solve by brute mass. A round arch pushes outward as much as downward, which means you need enormous walls to contain the thrust. A pointed arch directs force more steeply downward. A ribbed vault concentrates the load into identifiable points instead of smearing it across the whole ceiling. And a flying buttress takes the remaining outward thrust and carries it, externally, down to the ground. The result is a building that is lighter, that can be pierced with vast windows, and, this is the part that matters, that has a load path an engineer can actually trace. Romanesque construction is a pile. Gothic construction is a frame. Now I want to be careful here, because I have seen this claim overstated in places and I am not going to overstate it for you. Nobody in the 1190s was designing Gothic cathedrals for seismic resistance. That is not what motivated the change. The motivation was light, height, theology and fashion coming out of the Le de France. The men who rebuilt Lincoln were not running calculations about lateral acceleration. But the effect is real, regardless of the intent. And this is one of the quiet, recurring truths of architectural history. Buildings that fall down teach the next generation of builders something, even when the lesson is never written down and never consciously articulated. Lincoln fell. Lincoln was rebuilt differently. And the rebuilding pulled a whole national architectural tradition forward, which brings me to the thing about the 1185 earthquake that nobody talks about, and that I think is the actual reason it belongs in tonight's story. The shaking was not the worst part. The worst part, in a certain sense, was what the shaking meant. Try to inhabit the mind of an English peasant or an English cleric in April of 1185. You live in a universe where every event has a moral author. Nothing is random. Weather is not random. Illness is not random. Harvests are not random. Everything that happens is a message, and the sender is God, and the medium is the physical world. An earthquake in Syria is comprehensible within that framework. It is a distant place, full of unbelievers, of course the earth objects. An earthquake in Lincolnshire is not comprehensible. It is a violation of the ordinary rules. And when the thing that gets destroyed is not a tavern or a barn, but the cathedral itself, the single most sacred and most heavily built structure for 100 miles, the theological problem becomes acute. What does it mean when God knocks down God's own house? We know from the Chronicles that this question was asked, and asked seriously. The answer that circulates in the accounts is the one you would expect. It is punishment, a sign of divine anger, a warning to a sinful people, and possibly to a sinful clergy. Some accounts tie it to broader anxieties of the period, and this is a decade when English religious politics is still raw. Thomas Becket had been murdered in Canterbury Cathedral only 15 years earlier, an event that had shaken the English Church to its foundations in a rather different way, and the guilt of that killing still hung over Henry II's reign. So the aftermath of Lincoln is not primarily a body count. It is a spiritual crisis with a physical trigger, and that spiritual crisis has real material consequences. Money moves, patronage moves. A bishop is chosen for his holiness rather than his politics, and a building goes up that changes English architecture permanently. That is the pattern I want you to start seeing. In Aleppo, the earthquake destroyed the walls and the aftermath was war. In Lincoln, the earthquake destroyed the cathedral, and the aftermath was a theological reckoning that rebuilt the skyline of a nation. The ground shakes for 90 seconds. The consequences run for a century. Part 5. The problem of the Intraplate earthquake. I want to pause on Lincoln a moment longer, because there is a piece of modern science hiding inside this medieval story, and it is a genuinely unsettling one. Most earthquakes happen where plates meet. That is the simple version, and it is mostly true. The overwhelming majority of the world's seismic energy is released along plate boundaries. The Pacific Ring of Fire, the Mediterranean and Himalayan belt, the mid-ocean ridges. If you overlay a map of earthquakes on a map of plate boundaries, they match almost perfectly. Almost, there is a category of earthquake that happens in the middle of plates, hundreds or thousands of kilometers from any boundary, in crust that is supposed to be stable. Seismologists call these intraplate earthquakes, and they are, in several important ways, more frightening than the ones at the edges. They are more frightening for three reasons. The first is that nobody expects them, which means nobody builds for them. A city in Japan or Chile or California has building codes written in blood, generation after generation of hard-won structural requirements. A city in the interior of a continent has building codes written for wind and snow load, and its old building stock, churches, town halls, terraces of masonry housing, has never been tested laterally and would fail immediately if it were. The second is that ancient continental crust is cold, hard and unfractured, which means seismic waves travel through it far more efficiently than through the warm, broken, heavily faulted crust at a plate margin. An intraplate earthquake of a given magnitude is felt over a dramatically larger area than the same magnitude at a boundary. This is exactly what the English chronicles describe, an event felt across an enormous swath of the country. That is not exaggeration. That is the physics of a strong, cold shield transmitting energy without absorbing it. And the third reason is the one that should genuinely bother you. Intraplate faults have recurrence intervals measured not in decades or centuries, but in thousands of years, which means they have no history. There is no living memory, there is no folk tradition telling you to run for the hills, there is often no surface expression of the fault at all, no visible scarp, no valley, nothing an eye can read. The fault sits there, invisible, accumulating strain at a fraction of a millimetre a year, for longer than the civilization above it has existed. And then it goes. England has had these, not just 1185. The country experiences small tremors regularly and has recorded a handful of genuinely significant events across its history, including a substantial North Sea earthquake in the 16th century that damaged buildings in London and was felt across the Channel. Which means the ground under a quiet, safe, tectonically boring country is not as quiet as it looks. It is simply slow. And slow, as every one of the cities in tonight's story eventually discovered, is not the same thing as safe. Now we move south and east into the Mediterranean and into an event that is in some ways the strangest of the six, because the earthquake itself happened somewhere nobody was standing, and the killing was done by water that arrived at coastlines hundreds of miles apart, in cities that had felt nothing at all. The date is the 8th of August, 1303. The location is the seafloor somewhere in the Hellenic Arc, the great curving subduction zone that runs south of Greece, past Crete, and around toward Rhodes, where the African plate is being forced down and northward beneath the Aegean. This is the most seismically active region in Europe. It has been for millions of years. It is the engine that built the Greek islands, that fuels Santorini, that has repeatedly rearranged the entire eastern Mediterranean. Crete sits directly on top of it. The 1303 event was, by modern estimates, based on the pattern of reported damage and the reach of the wave, an extremely large earthquake, the kind of magnitude that only subduction zones produce, and yet it did to Crete what such earthquakes do. Contemporary accounts describe widespread destruction across the island. Candia, the Venetian capital of Crete, the city we now call Heraklion, was heavily damaged. Churches came down. Harbour works came down. The Venetian administration, which had governed the island since carving it out of the wreckage of the Fourth Crusade a century earlier, found itself governing a debris field. But Crete, honestly, is not why this earthquake matters to our story. What matters is Alexandria. Alexandria, Egypt, is roughly 300 miles south of the Cretan coast. It felt no meaningful shaking. There was no warning of any kind. It was a summer morning in the greatest port of the eastern Mediterranean, a city of merchants and warehouses and ships, and the sea was ordinary. And then, the sea left. This is one of the most consistently reported and most lethal features of tsunamis in the pre-modern record. and I want to explain the physics of it, because it is the single detail that has killed more people than any other in the history of these events. A tsunami is not a wave in the ordinary sense. An ordinary wave is a disturbance of the surface. The water goes up and down, and the energy moves through it. A tsunami is a displacement of the entire water column, top to bottom, all the way to the seafloor. It is not a wave on the ocean. It is the ocean itself, moving, and because it is a full column displacement, it has a trough as well as a crest. If the trough arrives first, the sea does not rise, it withdraws. It drains out of the harbour, out past the moorings, out past the breakwater, exposing seafloor that no living person has ever seen, leaving fish flapping on wet sand and boats lying on their sides in mud. Now imagine you are a 14th century Alexandrian. You have no framework for this. You have never heard the word tsunami, and neither has anyone you have ever met. What you see is a miracle, or a marvel, or at minimum an extraordinary opportunity, an entire harbour floor, suddenly walkable, scattered with fish, and lost cargo and whatever has been dropped over the side of ships for the last 1,000 years. So you walk out onto it. Everybody walks out onto it. And then the water comes back. This exact sequence, withdrawal, curiosity, crowd, return, appears in account after account across the entire pre-modern world, from the Mediterranean to Japan to the Indian Ocean. And it was still killing people in the 21st century for precisely the same reason. The withdrawal is not a reprieve, it is the inhale. The accounts of Alexandria in 1303 describe serious flooding, ships driven inland, destruction along the waterfront, and significant loss of life. And here is the detail that ties the disaster to the physical landscape of the city in the most poignant possible way. The 1303 event is generally regarded as the final blow to the ruins of the Pharos, the great lighthouse of Alexandria. Think about that for a moment. The Pharos was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Built under the Ptolemies more than 1,500 years earlier, it had stood for longer than most civilizations last. It had already been damaged by earlier earthquakes, this was not its first, and by 1303 it was a wounded, reduced structure, a stump of its former self. But it was still there, still standing, still, in some diminished form, doing its job of marking the harbour. And on a summer morning in 1303, an earthquake that happened 300 miles away, in water, involving a plate boundary nobody in Alexandria knew existed, finished it. The rubble was eventually used to build a fort on the same site, which is still there today. You can go and look at it. It is made in part of the wonder it replaced. Part 7. What the water does that the earth does not. I want to sit with tsunamis for a while, because they are the purest expression of tonight's central idea that the shaking is not the worst part. Ground shaking is local. It attenuates with distance. Its energy spreads outward in 3 dimensions through rock, and it loses intensity rapidly. 20 miles from an epicenter, an earthquake that flattened the town at the center might merely rattle the windows. That is why the damage from even a very large earthquake is fundamentally bounded by geography. A tsunami is not bounded by anything. It travels across open ocean at speeds comparable to a jet airliner. In deep water, 600 kilometers an hour is not unusual. And in that deep water it is almost invisible. The wave height might be a foot or 2, spread across a wavelength of 100 miles. A ship at sea passes over it, and the crew feels nothing whatsoever. Sailors have sailed straight over tsunamis that were about to destroy the port they were heading for, and noticed nothing. Then the wave reaches the shelf. The water gets shallower. The front of the wave slows down. The back of the wave, still in deep water, does not. The whole enormous mass compresses, and all that energy which had been spread horizontally across 100 miles of ocean gets converted upward. The wave stands up, and what arrives at the shore is not a breaking wave that crashes and retreats. It is a rising, relentless flood that does not stop rising, a wall of water that keeps coming for minutes, carrying inside it every boat, every piece of timber, every stone, every animal, and every person it has already collected. The physical damage is done less by the water itself than by the debris suspended in it. A tsunami is not a flood, it is a moving demolition field. For a medieval port, this is close to an unsurvivable event, and for reasons that go beyond the immediate drowning. Consider what a port city is. It is warehouses at sea level. It is the grain store on the quay. It is the fishing fleet, which is the food supply and the livelihood of half the population. It is the harbour works, the moles and breakwaters that took generations to build and that make the port a port rather than a stretch of coast. It is the fresh water, wells and cisterns near the shore, which after a tsunami are filled with salt water and remain useless for years. So the aftermath of a tsunami in 1303 is not a rescue problem. It is an economic annihilation. The ships are gone, so you cannot trade. The nets and boats are gone, so you cannot fish. The warehouses are gone, so the stored grain is gone. The wells are salted, so you cannot drink. And the farmland behind the shore, if the water reached it, is now salted too, and will not produce a crop for a decade. You survived the wave. Now you starve. And there is a second-order effect that runs even deeper, one that reshaped the Mediterranean world in the years around this event. Venice's control of Crete was expensive and precarious. The island's Greek population had rebelled repeatedly against Venetian rule. Every one of these disasters, and 1303 was severe, drained the treasury of a colonial administration that was already stretched, forced reconstruction spending that could not be recovered, and weakened the fortifications that held the island in the first place. Disasters do not fall on empty landscapes. They fall on political systems that are already under load. And they find the weak points. Part 8. The moment it all gets worse. Now I need to bring you to the middle of the 14th century, and I need to warn you that from this point tonight's story changes character, because in the year 1348, the calculation about what kills people after an earthquake stops being about war, or water, or stone, and starts being about something far harder to survive. In the summer of 1347, Genoese trading ships arriving from the Black Sea brought into the ports of Sicily an infection that would, within 4 years, kill somewhere between a third and a half of the population of Europe. The Black Death. The single most catastrophic demographic event in recorded human history. By January of 1348, it was moving up the Italian peninsula and into the Alpine passes. And on the 25th of January 1348, in the region of Friuli, in the Eastern Alps, at the junction of what is now Italy, Slovenia, and Austria, the ground ruptured. The Friuli earthquake of 1348 is one of the largest seismic events in the recorded history of the Alps. It was felt across an extraordinary area. Accounts exist from Italy, from Austria, from Bohemia, from as far as Germany. In the mountain valleys of Carinthia and Friuli, castles and churches came down. And in the mountains themselves, the shaking triggered something that in Alpine terrain is often deadlier than the earthquake: massive rock slides. The most famous of them buried the town of Villac in Carinthia when a portion of the Debrach mountain came away and came down. Villac was a significant regional centre, a river crossing and trading town, and the accounts describe it as devastated. Buildings destroyed, the river dammed by debris, and hundreds dead. But it is the timing that makes Friuli the hinge of tonight's story. Because the survivors of that earthquake climbed out of the rubble in January of 1348, and the thing that was walking toward them through the passes was not a rescue party. Part 9. Friuli, and the worst year in European history. I want you to try to hold two things in your head at once, because the people of Friuli and Carinthia in 1348 had to hold them, and I am not certain the human mind is built for it. The first thing is the earthquake. On the 25th of January, in the depth of an Alpine winter, the ground moved. Not for a few seconds, the accounts describe shaking that went on long enough to be terrifying, followed by aftershocks that continued for weeks and in some accounts for months. buildings that survived the first shock came down in the 2nd, or the 5th, or the 20th. The second thing is that this happened in January. In the Alps, I need to spend a moment on that, because it is the sort of detail that gets skipped in the retelling, and it is very possibly the deadliest single fact about the entire event. An earthquake in January in a mountain region does not simply destroy your house. It destroys your shelter, in the season when shelter is the difference between being alive and not being alive. Medieval Alpine winter survival is a carefully engineered system, and every part of it is inside the building that just collapsed. The heat source is the hearth, which is now buried. The food is the winter stores, grain, salted meat, preserved vegetables, which are in the cellar, which is now under the house. The livestock, which in many Alpine dwellings overwintered in the lower level of the same building, precisely because animal body heat helped warm the family above, are dead under the same rubble. The clothing and the bedding are in there too. So on the 26th of January, 1348, in a valley at altitude, you are alive, and you are standing outside in the snow with nothing. There is no relief column coming, because the roads through the passes are blocked with rockfall, and it is winter, and they were marginal roads at the best of times. There is no neighbouring village with a surplus, because the neighbouring village is in the same condition. There is no rebuilding, because you cannot quarry stone or fell timber or the 1009th mortar in frozen ground with a broken body and no food. The historical accounts give figures for deaths in the earthquake itself. What they cannot give, what no premodern source ever gives, is the number of people who died in February and March of exposure, of hunger, of untreated injuries that became infected, of the diseases that always follow when people are crowded into whatever shelter remains with contaminated water and no sanitation. That number was almost certainly larger than the number killed by falling stone. It always is. It was true in Aleppo, it was true in Friuli, and it remains true in the 21st century, where the medical literature on earthquake mortality consistently shows a secondary wave of deaths in the days and weeks afterward, from crush injury complications, from wound infection, from exposure, and from the collapse of the systems that were keeping chronically ill people alive. The shaking is the event. The aftermath is the death toll. And then, into that, arrived the plague. Part 10. When two catastrophes occupy the same space. The Black Death reached northern Italy in the early months of 1348 and moved into the Alpine regions through the spring and summer. Which means that the population of Friuli and Carinthia, a population that had spent the winter homeless, malnourished, injured and crowded together in improvised shelter, met the deadliest pandemic in European history in precisely the physiological and social condition most likely to kill them. I want to be careful and honest here, because there is a version of this story that gets told badly, and I do not want to tell it badly. The earthquake did not cause the plague. Yersinia pestis arrived on ships from the Black Sea and would have arrived in the Alps whether or not the ground had moved in January. The chronology is a coincidence of the most brutal kind, not a chain of causation. But coincidence is not the same as irrelevance. A population that has lost its winter food stores is a malnourished population, and malnutrition impairs immune response. A population living in improvised communal shelter is a population living at high density with poor sanitation, which is exactly the environment in which fleas, rats, and person-to-person transmission all flourish. A population that has lost its buildings has lost its ability to isolate the sick, and a population that has just watched the earth destroy its churches has lost, in the most literal sense, the institution it would have turned to for care of the dying. The earthquake did not cause the plague. The earthquake made the plague worse. And that distinction matters, because it is the same distinction that runs through every disaster in tonight's story. The event and the vulnerability are two different things, and it is the interaction between them that produces the body count. Now here is the part that I find genuinely difficult to think about, and it is the part where the two catastrophes stop being separate in the minds of the people living through them. Because from inside 1348, There is no distinction between a tectonic event and a bacterial one. There is no germ theory. There is no plate tectonics. There is one framework, and it is theological, and within that framework the earthquake in January and the pestilence in July are not two unrelated phenomena that happen to overlap. They are two chapters of the same message. Read the chronicles of this period, and you find exactly that reading. The earthquake is described as a portent, a sign, the first blow. The plague is the fulfillment. Some accounts explicitly link them, suggesting that the Earth's rupture released corrupted air, and this is worth understanding properly, because it was the leading medical theory of the age, not a fringe idea. The miasma theory held that disease was carried by corrupted air, bad vapours, foul exhalations. And what is an earthquake within that theory? But the Earth opening and breathing out whatever has been trapped inside it? It is a completely wrong explanation. It is also, given the available evidence, an entirely reasonable one. The ground opened. Months later, people began dying in unprecedented numbers. The correlation is right there, and the causal story writes itself, and there is no instrument, no experiment. No microscope anywhere in the world in 1348 that could tell anyone it was false. And this is where the aftermath of a medieval earthquake stops being about rubble and starts being about something much more dangerous. Because if the disasters are a punishment, then somebody must have done something. Punishment implies a crime. And a population that is homeless, starving, grieving, and now dying of a disease nobody understands, holding a framework in which everything happening to them is a divine response to human wickedness, will begin, inevitably, predictably, catastrophically, to look for the wicked. They found them. They found them in 1348 and 1349, across the Rhineland and Switzerland and Alsace and the German lands, in what became one of the worst campaigns of massacre in medieval European history. Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells, of causing the pestilence, of bringing down the wrath that everyone could feel around them. Entire communities were destroyed. Cities that had hosted Jewish populations for centuries eliminated them in a matter of days. The accusations were investigated at the time by people who concluded they were baseless. Pope Clement VI issued papal bulls explicitly condemning the persecutions and pointing out the obvious fact that Jews were dying of the plague at the same rate as everyone else, and the massacres continued anyway. I raise this now, in the Friuli section, because it is the hinge into our next city, and because it demonstrates the final and most terrible form the aftermath can take. The earth shakes, the buildings fall, the food runs out, the sickness arrives. And then, when the suffering exceeds what any explanation can hold, the survivors turn on each other. That is not a moral failing unique to the 14th century. It is what happens when a catastrophe is larger than a society's capacity to explain it. Part 11. Basel, the 18th of October 1356, 8 years after Friuli. 200 miles to the west. A prosperous city on the Rhine, at the point where the river turns north, where the borders of what would become Switzerland, France and Germany converge. Basel in 1356 is a rich, dense, sophisticated place. It sits on one of the most important trade arteries in Europe. It has a cathedral, the Minster, a magnificent red sandstone building on a terrace above the river. It has walls, towers, guild houses, a bishop, a bridge across the Rhine that is one of the few in the entire upper reaches of the river, and a major source of the city's wealth. It has also, only 8 years earlier, been the site of one of the worst of the plague massacres. In January of 1349, the Jewish community of Basel was destroyed. Several hundred people were confined to a wooden building on an island in the Rhine and burned alive, and the survivors were expelled, and the city council swore an oath that no Jew would be permitted to settle in Basel for 200 years. I tell you this not as an aside. I tell you because 7 years after that oath, on the evening of the 18th of October 1356, the ground beneath Basel ruptured in the largest earthquake ever recorded in Central Europe, and the city that had burned its neighbours to appease heaven burned to the ground itself. I am not going to tell you that one caused the other. I do not believe that, and neither does any historian or seismologist. But I will tell you that the people of Basel in October of 1356 lived in a universe where that connection was not merely available, it was obvious. And I will tell you that the memory of it hangs over the accounts of what happened next. Here is what happened. The first shock came in the early evening, around the hour of Vespers. It was strong enough to alarm the entire city, strong enough to send people into the streets, strong enough that many left their houses and did not go back in. It damaged buildings. It did not, by most accounts, destroy them. And then there was a gap, perhaps an hour. Long enough for some people to conclude it was over, long enough for some to go back inside to assess the damage, to retrieve possessions, to check on the elderly and the sick. And then, roughly an hour later, the main shock arrived. Part 12. The hour between the shocks. I want to stop the story right there, in that gap, because I think it is the most instructive 60 minutes in tonight's entire narrative. Basel, early evening, the 18th of October 1356. The first shock has passed. The city is standing in the streets, dust is coming off the roofs, somewhere a wall has fallen and people are pulling at it. The cathedral bells may have rung on their own. The detail appears in accounts of many medieval earthquakes, bells sounding without a hand on the rope, and it is a real phenomenon. The ground motion swinging heavy suspended masses. And now every single person in that city faces a decision. Do you go back inside? Every argument says yes. It is October in the Rhine Valley and the evening is cold. Your children are frightened and there is a fire in your hearth. Your possessions, everything you own, every coin, every tool of your trade, are in that building. Your food is in there. And critically, from the perspective of a 14th century mind, the event appears to have concluded. The earth shook. The earth stopped. Things that have stopped are over. Nobody in Basel possesses the concept of a foreshock. That word does not exist. The idea that a moderate earthquake might be the opening statement of a larger one rather than the event itself is not available to anyone in Europe in 1356. It would not be properly articulated for another 500 years. So they went back inside, many of them at least, and an hour later the main shock brought the city down on top of them. Now I want to be precise about the physics here, because this pattern, a foreshock, a gap, and then the real event, is not a medieval curiosity. It is one of the most consistently lethal sequences in seismology, and it works the same way today that it worked in 1356. Faults do not fail cleanly. A rupture begins at a point, the hypercenter, and propagates outward across the fault surface. Sometimes it propagates a short distance, encounters a strong patch of the fault that will not break, and stops. That is a moderate earthquake, and it is complete in itself. But the stress it just transferred onto that strong patch is now sitting there, added to whatever strain was already accumulated. And if the strong patch was already close to its threshold, that transferred stress can push it over, not immediately, but after some delay, as the fault responds and adjusts and afterslip migrates. Which means a moderate earthquake can be a trigger. The problem, and this is the part that has not changed in 700 years, is that you cannot tell which one you are in. Not in 1356, and not now. A moderate earthquake is, statistically, almost always just a moderate earthquake. Somewhere in the range of 15 to 20% of large earthquakes are preceded by identifiable foreshocks, which means the great majority arrive with no warning at all, and running the logic in the other direction, the great majority of moderate earthquakes are followed by nothing. So the honest guidance then and now is a probability statement that no frightened person standing in a cold street with children wants to hear, "This is probably over, and you should behave as though it might not be." The people of Basel did not have that guidance. They had a cold evening and an open door. Part 13. What the shaking actually did to Basel. The main shock of the 18th of October 1356, is estimated by modern seismologists, working backward from the distribution of damage across a very wide area, which is the standard method for these historical events, to have been somewhere in the range of magnitude 6.5, possibly a little more. Now that number may sound modest to you if you have been following modern earthquake news, where the headline events are 7s and 8s and occasionally 9s. So let me put it in context, because context is everything with magnitude. A magnitude 6.5 is not a great earthquake by global standards, but it happened directly beneath a densely built medieval city at shallow depth, in a region with no seismic building tradition whatsoever, in structures made of unreinforced stone and timber that had never been designed to resist a lateral force of any kind. And crucially, it happened in the Upper Rhine Graben, a rift valley, which means the city sits on soft sedimentary basin fill rather than hard bedrock. Soft sediment amplifies seismic waves. It can multiply the shaking intensity several times over what the same earthquake would produce on rock a few miles away. The result was total. The accounts describe the city of Basel as essentially destroyed, not damaged. Destroyed, the cathedral lost its towers and its choir, churches across the city came down. And in the surrounding countryside, the destruction extended outward for a remarkable distance. Dozens of castles across the Alsace, the Jura and the Basel region were wrecked, and many of them were never rebuilt. If you travel through that landscape today, you are looking at a ruined field that is, in significant part, a map of a single evening in 1356. Castles that had stood for 2 centuries stopped existing that night and simply stayed stopped. But here is the thing about Basel that makes it the centerpiece of tonight's story. The earthquake did not destroy Basel. The fire destroyed Basel. Part 14. Fire. Every account of the 1356 disaster agrees on this. The shaking brought down walls and roofs and towers, and it killed people, and the number it killed was significant. But what erased the city as a physical place was the fire that started in the collapsed buildings and burned, by most accounts, for days. Understand the mechanism, because it is beautifully and horribly simple. A medieval city is heated and lit by open flame. Every household has a hearth, and in the evening of an October day, every one of those hearths is lit. Every workshop has a furnace, or a forge, or a lamp. Every church has candles. There is no such thing as a heat source that is not an actual, physical, burning fire sitting in a container. Now shake the containers. The hearth is a stone or clay structure holding burning wood. When the wall behind it collapses, the burning wood goes into the room, and the room is made of timber, with floors of timber, with a roof of thatch or wooden shingles, filled with straw bedding and stored textiles and firewood, and, in a great many houses, the workshop materials of whatever trade the family practiced: tallow, oil, pitch, cloth, wool, dried goods. Multiply that by every building in the city, simultaneously, and then consider that the medieval urban street plan is the most efficient fire propagation geometry ever accidentally devised. Streets a few feet wide, upper stories jettied outwards so that buildings on opposite sides of a lane nearly touch above your head. Shared walls. Continuous roof lines running the length of a block, and then consider the final, cruelest detail, the one that turns a fire into an inferno. There is nobody to fight it. Medieval cities did have fire response. It was not sophisticated, but it was real. Bucket chains, hooks for pulling down burning thatch, ordinances requiring households to keep water vessels, sometimes designated wards responsible for turning out. A single house fire in a well-run medieval city was often contained, but every element of that system had just been destroyed by the earthquake. The people who would form the bucket chain are injured, or dead, or searching for their own families in their own rubble. The water supply, wells and cisterns may be blocked by debris or fouled. The streets along which you would carry water are impassable, filled with fallen stone. And the fire has not started in one place. It has started in 300 places at once, in a city where fire suppression is a manual, human process that depends entirely on getting there quickly. So Basel burned. Everything burned. The accounts describe a city consumed, and the population out in the fields and on the riverbank watching it go. And this is the pattern I want to hammer home, because it repeats across the entire global history of urban earthquakes, and it is the single most important thing on which tonight's title rests. Lisbon, 1755, the most famous earthquake in European history, killed a great many people with shaking, then killed more with a tsunami, and then burned for the better part of a week, and it was the fire that consumed most of the city. Tokyo and Yokohama, 1923, the Great Kant earthquake, produced a firestorm so intense that it generated its own weather system, a rotating fire whirl that killed tens of thousands of people who had gathered in an open area believing themselves safe. San Francisco, 1906, the city was ruined less by the fault rupture than by the 3 days of fire that followed, fed by broken gas mains and unfightable because the water system had been severed by the same shaking, in each case the same structure. The earthquake does not kill the city. The earthquake disables the city's ability to protect itself, and then something else arrives. The shaking is not the disaster. The shaking is the thing that removes your defences immediately before the disaster. Part 15. The aftermath in Basel, and what a city does with its guilt. The rebuilding of Basel is, in its own way, as revealing as the destruction. The city did rebuild. That is worth pausing on, because it was not inevitable. Plenty of medieval settlements that suffered catastrophic damage were simply abandoned, the population dispersed to surrounding villages, the site was quarried for stone, and the place ceased to exist. Basel had reasons not to disappear: the bridge, the river, the trade routes, the bishopric. Its location was too valuable to give up. So the citizens came back and started again, and they started again with rules. In the wake of the fire, Basel, like a number of other cities that experienced this kind of event, took steps that we would now recognise as building regulation. Restrictions on the most dangerous materials, particularly on thatched roofing. Requirements pushing toward tile and stone. Attention to the width of streets and the spacing of structures. These were not seismic codes. Nobody was designing for lateral acceleration. They were fire codes, born out of the observation that the flames had done what the shaking had only begun. Which is, when you step back, exactly the right lesson to draw from the evidence available. They could not do anything about the Earth. They could do something about what happened in the 10 minutes after the Earth stopped. And so they did. But there is another aftermath, and it is less comfortable. Because a city that had, 7 years earlier, burned its Jewish population alive in order to appease a heaven it believed was angry, now sat in the ashes of its own burning. Part 16. The theology of a burned city. I want to handle this carefully, because it is the part of the Basel story that most retellings either ignore entirely or turn into something cheap, and it deserves neither. Here are the facts, in order. In January of 1349, with the plague approaching but not yet arrived, the Jewish community of Basel was destroyed. Several hundred people were killed. The survivors were expelled. The city council swore that no Jew would be permitted to live in Basel for 200 years. The stated justification was the well poisoning accusation, a claim that had already been examined and rejected by the Pope, and that made no sense even on its own terms, since Jewish communities were dying of the plague at the same rate as everyone else, and drinking from the same wells. The actual drivers were more mundane and more human. Fear that had nowhere to go. Debt owed to Jewish moneylenders that would be cancelled by the death of the creditor. And a mob dynamic in which city councils that initially resisted found themselves overwhelmed by guilds and populations demanding action. 7 years later, on an October evening, the same city was reduced to rubble and then to ash. Now, what did the survivors make of that? The honest answer is that the surviving accounts do not give us a clean single response, and I am not going to invent one for you. What we can say is that the interpretive framework available to those survivors was the same one that had produced the massacre. Everything that happens is a message. Catastrophe indicates displeasure. Displeasure indicates sin. And within that framework, a city that has just been destroyed has to ask what it did. Some of the response was straightforwardly penitential, processions, masses, donations, the standard vocabulary of medieval collective atonement. Some of it was the rebuilding itself, which had a devotional character. The restoration of the minster was an act of piety as much as engineering. But I want to draw your attention to something that this sequence reveals about the entire moral logic of the age, because it is the deepest lesson of the Basel story. The framework is unfalsifiable, and that is what makes it dangerous. If disaster means sin, then any disaster can be attributed to any group you are already inclined to blame. And crucially, punishing that group does not protect you, because the next disaster is a geological or bacteriological event that has nothing to do with your moral accounting. So when the next disaster comes, and it always comes, the framework does not say we were wrong about the cause. It says we did not do enough. That is the machinery that produced the pogroms of 1348 and 1349 across the Rhineland. It is the same machinery that would produce witch trials in the same region 2 centuries later, in the same valleys, often triggered by the same category of event: crop failure, sudden cold, unexplained illness, sudden death. In every case, an environmental phenomenon with a physical cause is processed as a moral phenomenon with a human author, and someone is found and destroyed, and nothing is prevented. I said at the start of tonight's story that the shaking was never the worst part. In Aleppo, the worst part was the war that the collapsed walls invited. In Friuli, the worst part was the winter and then the plague. In Basel, the worst part was the fire. But there is a version of the worst part that runs underneath all of them, and it is this. Catastrophe strips away the explanations a society has, and whatever it reaches for next is the measure of that society. Basel reached, in 1349, for its neighbours. In 1356, having nobody left to blame, it reached instead for building regulations, which is, and I say this without irony, an enormous moral improvement. The city that could not explain the earth could at least control the thatch. Part 17. What Basel means for us. I want to say one more thing about Basel before we cross the world to our final city, because it is not only a medieval story, it is an active problem. The 1356 earthquake is the largest known seismic event in the history of Central Europe. It happened in a region that most people, including most people who live there, regard as tectonically safe. Switzerland, the Alsace, southwestern Germany. Not a plate boundary, not the Ring of Fire. The Upper Rhine Graben is a rift, a place where the crust is being slowly pulled apart. Extension is slow, strain accumulates slowly, and the recurrence interval on the faults there is very long enough that the last major event was 700 years ago, and there is nothing in living memory or in any local tradition to suggest the ground is capable of what it did in 1356. Which puts Basel in exactly the category we discussed with Lincoln. It is an intraplate problem. No expectation, therefore no preparation. No recent events, therefore no memory. Slow faults, therefore no visible warning. And the modern city of Basel, which sits on that same basin fill, is one of the most industrially significant urban areas in Europe, a major chemical and pharmaceutical centre, a river port, a rail hub with a nuclear research infrastructure and a population density unimaginable in 1356. Swiss seismic hazard assessments identify Basel as the highest hazard urban area in the country, precisely because of 1356. Modern Swiss building codes account for it. The problem, as always, is the existing building stock, the historic core, the 19th century masonry, the structures that predate any code at all. And there is a coda to this that I think is one of the most remarkable stories in modern geoscience. In 2006, a geothermal energy project in Basel was drilling deep into the crust beneath the city and injecting water at high pressure to fracture the rock, the standard technique for enhanced geothermal systems. The injection triggered earthquakes. Small ones, but felt across the city, enough to cause minor damage and, more importantly, enough to cause alarm in a population that knew exactly what had happened there before. The project was suspended and eventually abandoned. 700 years after the fault destroyed the city accidentally touched the fault, and the fault answered. Part 18, Kamakura, the 20th of September 1498. We end in Japan, and we end with an event that ties every thread of tonight's story together. Because it involves shaking and water and aftermath, and, in the most literal sense imaginable, a permanent alteration of a sacred landscape that you can go and stand in front of today. The date, in the Japanese reckoning of the era, falls in the 11th year of May, and the event is known as the May earthquake. The 20th of September 1498, the location is the Nankai Trough, the great subduction zone that runs along the southern coast of Japan, where the Philippine sea plate is being forced down beneath the Eurasian plate. This is a system that has produced enormous earthquakes on a roughly regular cycle for as long as Japanese records exist, which is a very long time. It is the system that Japanese authorities watch today with more anxiety than any other, because it sits beneath the most densely populated industrial corridor in the country. In 1498 it ruptured, and modern estimates place the magnitude at somewhere in the range of 8.5, possibly higher, and the tsunami that followed came ashore along the entire Pacific coast of central Japan. The accounts describe devastation across a vast stretch of coastline, waves that penetrated far inland. Communities erased. The death toll, as always with premodern figures, is uncertain, but the estimates run into the tens of thousands, and given the extent of the affected coast and the population of the region, a figure in that range is not implausible. The May tsunami is also credited with one of the most consequential geographic changes in Japanese history. Lake Hamana, on the coast of what is now Shizuoka Prefecture, had been a freshwater lake separated from the Pacific by a sand barrier. The tsunami of 1498 broke through that barrier. The sea came in and stayed. Lake Hamana has been a brackish tidal lagoon connected to the ocean ever since. A permanent change to the map of Japan, made in a single afternoon and still visible on every chart 500 years later. But it is Kamakura that concerns us. Kamakura sits on the coast of Sagami Bay, south of modern Tokyo. In the 13th century it had been the seat of the shogunate, the effective capital of Japan for a century and a half, and although by 1498 its political importance had faded considerably, it remained a major religious centre, dense with temples. And in Kamakura, at the temple of Kotokyu-in, there stood and stands the great Buddha. Part 19. The Buddha in the open air. I want to describe this statue properly, because the story that follows depends on understanding what it is. The Kamakura Daibutsu is a bronze figure of Amida Buddha seated in meditation, cast in the middle of the 13th century. It stands roughly 11.5 metres tall and weighs somewhere in the region of 120 tons. It is not carved, it was cast in sections in bronze and assembled, an extraordinary feat of 13th century metallurgy and engineering, and when it was built, it sat inside a building. There was a great wooden hall enclosing it, a temple structure of the kind that housed monumental Buddhist images throughout Japan, with the statue in dimness, in incense, in the specific religious atmosphere that an enclosed sacred interior produces. That is how it was meant to be experienced. That is what its makers intended. The hall was destroyed, and then rebuilt, and then destroyed again. The records describe damage from storms and typhoons across the 14th and 15th centuries, each time requiring reconstruction of an enormous and expensive wooden building. And then came 1498. The accounts describe the tsunami reaching Kamakura and sweeping inland through the valley in which the temple sits, a distance from the shore of something over half a mile, and destroying the hall entirely. The statue did not move. Part 20. What the water left behind. 120 tons of cast bronze seated on a stone base in a valley half a mile from the sea. The wave came up through the valley, took the wooden hall apart, carried it away, and left the Buddha sitting exactly where it had been sitting for 250 years. And here is the detail that makes this the perfect closing image for tonight's story. They never rebuilt the hall. The great Buddha of Kamakura has sat in the open air, under weather, since 1498. If you go there today, and hundreds of thousands of people do every year, you are looking at a statue that was designed to be seen in the dark, in an enclosed sanctuary, and that has instead spent 5 centuries in rain and snow and sun, because a wave took its roof away and nobody ever put another one back. Why not? The sources do not give us a single clean explanation, and I am not going to invent one. But we can reason about it honestly. The most likely answer is economic and political. Rebuilding a monumental temple hall is an enormous undertaking, requiring a wealthy patron, and Japan in 1498 was entering the Sengoku period, the age of warring states. A century and a half of near continuous civil war in which the central authority of the shogunate collapsed and the country fragmented into competing domains. Kamakura had already lost its political centrality. The patronage networks that had built and rebuilt that hall 3 times were dissolving. There was, quite simply, nobody with both the money and the inclination. But there is a second reading that I find harder to dismiss, and it comes from within the tradition itself, because the image of a Buddha sitting in perfect equanimity while the building around him is destroyed by water is not, within Buddhist thought, an accident that needs correcting. It is very nearly a doctrinal illustration. Impermanence, the idea that all constructed things arise and pass away, is one of the foundational teachings. The hall was a constructed thing. It passed away. 3 times, in fact. The figure inside it, representing something that is not a constructed thing, remained, whether or not anyone at Kotoko inarticulated it that way in 1498. The result is one of the most powerful accidental pieces of religious art in the world. The disaster did not diminish the statue. It edited it. It removed a layer and revealed something that turned out to be more affecting than what the original builders designed. I have been telling you all night that the shaking is never the worst part. Kamakura is the one place in tonight's story where I have to say something slightly different. Kamakura is where the aftermath was not only destruction, it was transformation. The wave took the roof, and what was left underneath became more famous, more visited, and more meaningful than it had ever been enclosed. That is not consolation for the tens of thousands who died along that coast in 1498. Nothing is. But it is worth noticing, because it is the only moment in 6 catastrophes where the aftermath produced something rather than only taking it. Part 21. What Kamakura tells us that the others do not. There is one more thing about the May earthquake that belongs in tonight's story, and it is arguably the most consequential thing in it, because it is still unfolding. The Nankai Trough does not rupture once, it ruptures in sequences. The Japanese historical record, and Japan has the longest, densest, most continuous written record of seismic events of any civilization on Earth, running back well over 1,000 years, shows that this subduction zone tends to fail in segments. And when one segment fails, the adjacent segment often fails too, sometimes within minutes, sometimes within hours, sometimes within years. There are documented pairs in the record, an earthquake on the eastern portion of the trough followed by an earthquake on the western portion, separated by intervals ranging from almost nothing to a couple of years. In the 17th century, a pair occurred. In the 19th century, a pair occurred roughly 32 hours apart, one enormous earthquake, then a day and a half of aftershocks and terror, and then a second enormous earthquake on the neighbouring segment. And in the 20th century, 2 more, separated by about 2 years. That pattern is why the May event of 1498 is studied so intensively, Because the question of exactly which segments ruptured in 1498, and whether the event was one rupture or a coupled sequence, feeds directly into the models that Japanese authorities use today to estimate what the next Nankai event will look like. And it is why Japan built, in the 21st century, something that no other country has: a formal advisory system that exists to tell the public that a large earthquake has just happened and that the probability of a much larger one has temporarily increased. Not a prediction. Nobody can predict earthquakes. What that system communicates is a probability shift, a statement that the baseline risk, which is normally vanishingly small on any given week, has jumped by roughly an order of magnitude for a limited window, and that the population in the affected region should be alert rather than alarmed. Which brings us, at the end of a story about the medieval world, back to the hour between the shocks in Basel in 1356. The people standing in that Swiss street had a decision to make and no information with which to make it. 700 years later, a Japanese family in the same situation would receive within minutes a formal statement from a national agency telling them that the ground beneath them had entered a temporarily elevated state. That is the entire distance our species has travelled on this problem. We still cannot tell you when. We still cannot tell you where, precisely. We still cannot tell you how big. What we have gained, in 7 centuries, is the ability to say honestly and quickly, this may not be over, and here is roughly how much more likely the worst case has become. It is a smaller gift than we would like. It is not nothing. And in the specific case of that gap between shocks, it is very possibly the difference between a family standing in a cold field for a night and a family under a collapsed roof. Part 22. 6 cities, 1 pattern. Let me pull the whole thing together now, because I want you to leave with the structure and not just the stories. Aleppo, 1138, the earthquake destroyed fortifications across a militarised frontier, and the aftermath was opportunistic warfare, in a landscape where every defensive structure had simultaneously ceased to function. The death toll traditionally quoted is almost certainly a scribal error conflating 2 separate disasters. The real figure was far lower, and yet the strategic consequences rippled outward for years. The stones fell. Then the armies moved. Lincoln, 1185. The earthquake happened in a country that has no business having earthquakes, in the middle of a tectonic plate, in crust that transmits seismic energy with terrible efficiency precisely because it is old and cold and unbroken. It destroyed the cathedral. And the aftermath was theological, a crisis of meaning in a society where nothing is random, which resolved into a rebuilding that helped carry the Gothic revolution into England. The building fell. Then the argument about what it meant reshaped a nation's architecture. Crete and Alexandria, 1303. The earthquake happened underwater on the Hellenic Arc, and the killing was done 300 miles away by a wave that arrived without any shaking at all, in a city that had received no warning of any kind and possessed no concept that would have let it interpret a retreating sea as anything other than a marvel. The water withdrew. Then it came back, and the ruins of one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world finally came down, 15 centuries after they went up. Friuli, 1348. The earthquake struck an Alpine region in the depth of January, destroying not merely shelter but the entire integrated system of winter survival. The hearth, the stores, the livestock, the roads. And then, into a population that was homeless, malnourished and crowded together, arrived the Black Death, which the earthquake did not cause and unquestionably made worse. And the framework available for understanding both events pointed toward human guilt, and the search for the guilty produced massacres across half of Europe. Basel, 1356. The largest earthquake in the recorded history of Central Europe, in a place that did not and does not believe it can have earthquakes, on soft basin sediment that amplified the shaking, preceded by a foreshock that sent people into the streets, and an hour of quiet that invited them back inside. And then the fire, 300 hearths tipping into 300 timber rooms, in a city whose firefighting capacity had been destroyed by the same shock that started the flames. The city burned for days. The shaking wrecked the buildings. The fire erased the city. Kamakura, 1498, a subduction zone rupture on the Nankai Trough, a tsunami along the entire central Pacific coast of Japan, tens of thousands dead, a freshwater lake permanently converted into an arm of the sea, and in one temple valley, a wooden hall carried away from around a bronze Buddha who has sat in the open air ever since. 6 events. 6 different secondary killers: war, meaning, water, winter and plague, fire, and the sea. And in every single case, the same underlying structure. The earthquake did not destroy the society. The earthquake destroyed the society's ability to defend itself, and then something else walked in through the gap. That is not a medieval observation. It is the operating principle of modern disaster management, stated in the plainest possible terms. The technical language is different. We talk about cascading failures, about critical infrastructure interdependency, about secondary hazards, but the content is identical. The initiating event matters less than the state of the system it hits and the sequence it unlocks. Part 23. What the medieval world could not know, and what we still cannot. I want to close on the epistemics, because I think that is where the real story of tonight lives. Every person in every one of those 6 cities was operating with an explanation for what happened to them. Not one of those explanations was correct. They were not stupid explanations. That is the thing I want to be very clear about, because there is a smug way of telling this history in which the medieval world is a gallery of superstitious fools and we are the clever ones who figured it out, and that version is both unkind and wrong. Consider what a 14th century observer actually had to work with. No instruments, no global communication network that could tell them the same thing had happened in Crete and Alexandria on the same morning. No historical database, only chronicles that were local, partial, and often centuries out of date. No concept of the earth having an interior structure. No concept of the crust being broken into pieces. No way to know that the ground beneath their feet was moving at all, ever, under any circumstances. Given that evidence base, the theory they arrived at, that the earth was responding to human moral conduct, is not irrational. It is a reasonable inference from a genuinely impoverished dataset. It fits the observations they had. Terrible things happened. Terrible things happened to people. There was no visible physical cause. The only agency anyone could identify anywhere in the picture was moral agency, so the moral explanation was the parsimonious one. The problem was never intelligence. The problem was that the mechanism was invisible and would remain invisible for another 600 years. I want to walk you very briefly through how long it took us to see it, because the timeline is genuinely humbling. The first serious systematic attempt in Europe to study earthquakes as physical rather than moral events came after Lisbon in 1755, an event so enormous and so public in the capital of a major European power on a religious holiday with the churches full, that it forced the question in a way no earlier disaster had. The Marquis of Pombal, running the reconstruction, sent out a questionnaire to parishes across Portugal asking what had been observed, how long the shaking lasted, which direction it came from, what happened to wells and animals and the sea. That survey is often called the beginning of seismology as a discipline. It is asking, for the first time at scale, not why did this happen to us, but what exactly happened. That is 1755, 400 years after Basel, and even then, the actual mechanism remained unknown. Through the 19th century, geologists could measure earthquakes, catalogue them, map their distribution, and correlate them with mountain ranges and volcanoes. What they could not explain was why. The dominant theory for much of that period was that the Earth was cooling and contracting, and that the crust was wrinkling like the skin of a drying fruit. It was wrong, but it was serious, and it was defended by serious people. The idea that the continents themselves move was proposed properly by Alfred Wegener in 1912, and it was rejected. Comprehensively, for decades, not because geologists were closed-minded, but because Wegener could not propose a plausible mechanism, he could show that the continents fit together and that the fossils matched across oceans, but he could not say what force was pushing a continent through solid rock, and the physicists of the day were confident that no such force existed. It took until the 1960s. The mapping of the ocean floor during and after the Second World War revealed the mid-ocean ridges. The discovery of magnetic striping on the seafloor, symmetrical bands of alternating polarity on either side of the ridges, recording the reversals of Earth's magnetic field like a tape recorder, proved that new crust was being manufactured at the ridges and spreading outward. And the recognition that deep earthquakes occurred along inclined planes descending beneath island arcs showed where the old crust was going back down. Plate tectonics, the theory that explains every single event in tonight's story, achieved general acceptance in the scientific community within the lifetime of people who are still alive today. Let that sit for a moment. The people of Basel in 1356 did not understand earthquakes. Neither did the people of Basel in 1956. So when we look back at a 14th century chronicler writing that the earth shook because of the sins of the people, the correct response is not condescension, it is recognition. He was doing the same thing we do, taking the best available framework and applying it to a catastrophe that demanded explanation. His framework was wrong. It was also the only one anyone had for another 6 centuries. And that leads to the uncomfortable question I want to leave you with. What are we wrong about? Because there is a very seductive feeling, when you learn how earthquakes actually work, that the problem is now solved. We know about plates. We know about subduction zones and strike-slip faults and elastic rebound. We know why Aleppo shook, and why Basel shook, and why the sea left Alexandria. We have instruments that can detect an earthquake on the far side of the planet. Satellites that measure crustal deformation to the centimetre. Ocean bottom sensors sitting directly on top of the most dangerous faults on Earth. And we still cannot tell you when. That is not a small gap. That is the entire practical problem, unsolved. We can tell you that a given fault is capable of a large earthquake. We can tell you roughly how often it has done so in the past. We can tell you, statistically, the probability over a window of decades. What we cannot do, what no agency on Earth can do, is tell a specific city on a specific morning that today is the day. The reason is worth understanding, because it is not a technology problem that better sensors will fix. It is a physics problem. Earthquakes are non-linear. The transition from a locked fault to a rupturing fault depends with extreme sensitivity on conditions that we cannot measure. The exact distribution of stress across a fault surface tens of kilometres underground, the fluid pressure in the fault zone, the frictional properties of the contact, the geometry of the strong patches and weak patches that determine whether a small rupture stops or keeps going. None of that is observable. It is buried under kilometres of rock. We infer it indirectly from surface measurements with poor resolution and significant lag. We are trying to read the internal state of a system we cannot see, using instruments separated from it by miles of stone, looking for signals that may not exist on timescales that may not be relevant. And the empirical record is brutal on this point. Something like 80 to 85% of large earthquakes arrive with no detectable precursor of any kind. No foreshock sequence. No anomalous deformation above the noise floor. No change in background seismicity. The fault is quiet, and then the fault is not quiet, and the first indication that anything has happened is the earthquake itself. Researchers have looked seriously and for a long time for something better. Groundwater levels, radon gas seeping through fractured rock, electromagnetic anomalies, changes in the statistical patterns of microseismicity, animal behaviour, which appears in medieval chronicles just as it appears in modern reports. Dogs refusing to enter buildings, fish behaving oddly, birds leaving. Every one of these has produced correlations in hindsight. Not one has produced a reliable operational prediction system. So the honest position, 700 years after Basel, is this. We understand the mechanism completely, and we can predict the timing not at all. What we can do instead is the thing Basel did after the fire. We cannot control the fault. We can control what happens in the 10 minutes afterward. That is what modern earthquake engineering is. Building codes that require lateral force resistance, ductile structural systems that bend rather than shatter. Base isolation, which decouples a building from the ground so the earth can move while the structure largely does not. Automatic gas shut-off valves, which exist specifically because of the fire lesson that Basel and Lisbon and San Francisco and Tokyo taught us in blood. Tsunami warning networks with seafloor pressure sensors that can detect a wave forming before it reaches a coast. Early warning systems that use the gap between fast-travelling pressure waves and slower shear waves to give a city somewhere between a few seconds and a minute of notice, enough to stop a train, halt a surgery, close a valve, get a child under a desk. Every one of those is a response to the same insight the citizens of Basel arrived at in the ashes. You cannot stop the shaking, but almost everything that kills you happens afterward, and afterward is negotiable. Part 24. The thing that has not changed at all. I want to end with the piece of this that is genuinely unchanged across 7 centuries, because I think it is the most important thing in tonight's story and the easiest one to miss. In every one of these 6 disasters, the physical event exposed a pre-existing vulnerability. Yet it did not create the vulnerability. It revealed it. Aleppo's vulnerability was that it sat in a militarized landscape where every party was waiting for an opportunity. The earthquake supplied one. Friuli's vulnerability was an economy of thin margins in a mountain winter where the loss of one season's stores was fatal. The earthquake removed the stores. Basel's vulnerability was a construction pattern of timber and thatch at extreme density with open fire in every room. The earthquake tipped the fires. Alexandria's vulnerability was a population with no cultural knowledge of what a retreating sea means. The wave exploited it, and in every case that vulnerability existed for entirely rational reasons before the disaster. Aleppo's fortresses were built for war because there was a war. Friuli's people lived on thin margins because that is what mountain agriculture affords. Basel built with timber because timber was cheap and abundant and worked well for 400 years. Alexandria had no tsunami tradition because tsunamis there occur perhaps once in several centuries, far longer than institutional memory. That is the pattern, and it is exactly as true now as it was then. Our vulnerabilities are also rational. We concentrate populations in coastal megacities because ports generate wealth. We build on soft sedimentary basins because rivers made those basins and rivers are where cities go. We create infrastructure systems of enormous interdependency, power feeding water treatment, feeding hospitals, feeding communications, feeding emergency response, because interdependency is efficient. Every one of those choices is defensible. Every one of them is also a Basel hearth, sitting there, waiting for the ground to tip it over. Part 25. The counting problem revisited. Before we close out, I owe you a return to something I raised at the very beginning and then set aside, because it has been quietly shaping everything I have told you tonight. The numbers. I told you at the start that the 230,000 figure attached to Aleppo is almost certainly wrong, a conflation of 2 separate disasters that got fused together by a later chronicler and then copied forward for 8 centuries. I want to come back to that now, because there is a lesson in it that goes well beyond one Syrian city. Here is how the error appears to have happened. A chronicler writing generations after the fact had access to accounts of the Aleppo region earthquake of 1138, and separately to accounts of a devastating earthquake at Ganja, in the Caucasus, which struck in 1139, and which was genuinely enormous. The Ganja event killed a great many people, and is associated with an extraordinary secondary effect. The shaking triggered a massive landslide that dammed a river valley and created Lake Gol, which still exists today in Azerbaijan and is a tourist destination. Somewhere in the transmission, the two events merged. One date, one place, both death tolls. And because the resulting figure was so spectacular, it got repeated. It entered the lists. It appears to this day in rankings of the deadliest earthquakes in human history, sitting near the top, attached to a city where the actual toll was probably a fraction of it. Now, why does this matter beyond pedantry? It matters because those lists are not decorative. Historical earthquake catalogues are one of the primary inputs into modern seismic hazard assessment. When engineers set the design basis for a building in a given region, how much shaking it must be able to survive, they are working from probabilistic models, and those models are calibrated against the historical record of what that fault system has done before. For regions with long recurrence intervals, the instrumental record covering the last 130 years or so is far too short to capture the full range of behaviour. So the historical and archaeological record has to fill the gap, which means a monk's arithmetic in the 12th century can, through a very long chain, influence the thickness of a wall in the 21st. This is a real and active field, and it is called historical seismology. And I find it one of the most quietly heroic disciplines in all of science. The practitioners are people who are simultaneously fluent in seismic physics and in medieval Arabic, or Latin, or classical Japanese, or Byzantine Greek. Their job is to take a chronicle entry that says the earth shook terribly, and many churches fell, and convert it, rigorously, into an estimate of ground motion intensity at that location. The method they use is essentially a reverse engineering of damage. There are standardized intensity scales, the modern one is the European macroseismic scale, and there are equivalents elsewhere which describe, in careful detail, what a given level of shaking does to different classes of building. At one level, hanging objects swing and sleepers wake. At another, poorly built masonry cracks. At another, well-built masonry suffers serious damage and weak structures collapse partially. At another, most masonry structures collapse entirely. So the historical seismologist reads the chronicle, identifies what kind of buildings are being described, works out what happened to them, and assigns an intensity to that location. Do that for enough locations, plot them on a map, draw contours around them, and you can reconstruct the pattern of shaking. From the pattern of shaking, you can estimate the epicenter, the depth, and the approximate magnitude. This is how we know that Basel in 1356 was around magnitude 6.5. Nobody measured it. It was calculated 6 centuries later from an inventory of ruined castles. And it is a process absolutely riddled with pitfalls, which the practitioners know better than anyone. Chroniclers exaggerate. Chroniclers copy each other, so 5 accounts may be 1 account. Chroniclers describe the places that had literate observers, which biases the map toward monasteries and cities and away from the countryside. Damage reports conflate the earthquake with the fire or the flood that followed. Dates are given in local reckoning systems that require careful conversion. And the absence of a report is not the absence of an event. It may simply be the absence of a survivor with a pen. So the numbers I have given you tonight, the tens of thousands at Kamakura, the thousands at Aleppo, the magnitude estimates, are all best efforts. They are honest. They are also uncertain, and the uncertainty is not a footnote. It is part of the story. And I raise it here at the end because it connects directly to the central theme. We do not know how many people died in the earthquakes. We know even less about how many died in the aftermaths, because aftermath deaths are the least recorded deaths in all of history. Nobody chronicles the family that froze in February in an Alpine valley. Nobody records the fisherman in Alexandria who survived the wave and starved 4 months later because his boat and his nets and his brother were gone. Nobody counts the villagers between Aleppo and Harim who lived through the shaking and died in the raiding that followed. The visible disaster gets a number. The invisible one, The longer, slower, larger one gets nothing at all, which is precisely why the thing I have been telling you all night is so easy to overlook. The historical record is structurally biased toward the shaking, because the shaking is dramatic and instantaneous and legible. Everything that came afterward happened slowly, in scattered places, to people whose deaths did not make a scene. Part 26. 6 cities today. Let me take you round all 6 one final time, but this time to the present, because every one of these places still exists, and every one of them still sits where it sat. Aleppo is still on the Dead Sea transform. That fault is still moving. It has produced repeated destructive earthquakes across recorded history, and in February of 2023, the same fault system ruptured further north in a catastrophic sequence centred on southern Turkey, and Aleppo was damaged again. A city that had already been shattered by more than a decade of modern war, hit by the same geology that hit it in 1138. Buildings already weakened by shelling came down under shaking. That is the Aleppo pattern in its purest form, the earthquake finding a vulnerability that human beings had already created. Lincoln's Cathedral still stands on its ridge, and the lower west front is still there. That thick Romanesque survivor from before 1185, welded onto the Gothic building that the disaster called into being. It is one of the few places in the world where you can stand and see the seam between the architecture that failed and the architecture that replaced it. Crete is still directly above the Hellenic Arc, the most seismically active zone in Europe, and Alexandria is still a low-lying Mediterranean port, one now facing a combination of tsunami exposure, land subsidence and sea level rise that makes it one of the more worried about coastal cities in the world. Friuli did it again. In 1976, a magnitude 6.5 earthquake struck almost exactly the same region, killed around 1,000 people and left tens of thousands homeless. The reconstruction that followed became a widely studied model of effective post-disaster rebuilding, local control, rapid decision-making, an explicit commitment to rebuilding communities in place rather than dispersing them. 628 years after the medieval catastrophe, the same valley shook, and this time the aftermath was handled well enough that people cite it as an example. Basel, as we discussed, remains the highest seismic hazard urban area in Switzerland, on soft basin sediment, in a rift system with recurrence intervals long enough that nobody's grandmother remembers anything. And Kamakura sits on Sagami Bay, on a coastline that the Japanese government models obsessively, in a country that has built the most sophisticated earthquake and tsunami warning infrastructure that has ever existed, precisely because it has the longest memory of what happens when you do not have one. The Great Buddha is still there, still open to the sky, and the temple grounds carry a marker showing how far the water came. Part 27. What I want you to take from this. I have 3 things, and then we are done. The first is that disasters are not events, they are processes. The earthquake is the trigger, not the disaster. The disaster is everything that unfolds through the systems the trigger disabled, the fire that cannot be fought, the food that cannot be reached, the wall that cannot be defended, the winter that cannot be survived, the sickness that cannot be isolated. If you only look at the shaking, you are looking at the smallest part of what happened. The second is that vulnerability is always built before the disaster, and always looks reasonable at the time. Nobody in Basel built with timber because they were foolish. They built with timber because it worked, until an evening in October when it did not. The question worth asking about any place you live or care about is not what might hit it. It is what would stop working, and what depends on that. And the third is about explanation, and it is the one I keep coming back to. Every society that suffers a catastrophe it cannot explain will reach for an explanation anyway, because human beings cannot tolerate meaningless suffering. What that society reaches for is the measure of it. In 1349, the Rhineland reached for its neighbours and murdered them, and it prevented nothing, and 7 years later Basel burned anyway. In 1356, the same city, with nobody left to blame, reached instead for the mundane and unglamorous work of regulating roofing materials, and that actually helped. The instinct to find a culprit and the instinct to find a cause feel identical from the inside. They are not. One of them produces pogroms and witch trials and conspiracy theories about weapons that cannot exist. The other produces fire codes and building standards and the seafloor sensors sitting in the dark above the Nankai Trough right now, waiting, part 28. The whisper before the scream. There is one more thread I want to pull, and then I will let you go. I have used the phrase foreshock several times tonight, and I have told you that nobody in the medieval world possessed the concept. That is true. But there is something stranger and more unsettling underneath it, which is that the concept is not actually usable even now, and understanding why closes the circle on everything we have covered. A foreshock is not a type of earthquake. This is the part that trips people up, so let me be as clear as I can. There is no physical property that distinguishes a foreshock from an ordinary earthquake. Nothing in the waveform, nothing in the depth or the mechanism or the duration. A foreshock is a classification applied retroactively after a larger earthquake comes along and redefines it. Until that larger earthquake happens, what you have is simply an earthquake, which means the citizens of Basel, standing in the street in that hour of quiet, were not making an error of knowledge. They were making a decision under irreducible uncertainty. The same irreducible uncertainty that a resident of Tokyo or Istanbul or Los Angeles faces today after a moderate shock. The overwhelming majority of the time, the answer is that it is over. Occasionally, it is not. And there is no instrument on Earth in 1356 or in 2026 that can tell you which situation you are in while you are in it. What has changed is not the knowledge, it is the honesty of the communication. The genuine advance of the modern era is not that we can predict, it is that we have built institutions willing to say publicly, in formal language, we do not know. And the probability has increased, and you deserve to be told both of those things at once. That is a much harder thing for a government to say than it sounds. Agencies do not naturally lead with uncertainty. They lead with reassurance, with competence, with the message that the situation is being handled. An advisory that says the risk has risen tenfold and we cannot tell you what will happen is an admission of limitation issued in public by an institution that would prefer not to admit limitations. It exists because at some point, somewhere, people concluded that the cost of not telling the public was higher than the cost of telling them something frightening and incomplete. The people of Basel were never told anything. Nobody could have told them. And so at some point during that quiet hour, a woman somewhere in that city looked at her children, and at the cold, and at the open door of a house that seemed to have survived, and made a decision that 1,000 ordinary evenings had taught her was correct. That is the image I have been carrying through this entire script, and I suspect it is the one that will stay with you too. Part 29. The Long Arithmetic. Let me give you one final way of holding all 6 of these events together, because I think it reframes them usefully. Every fault in tonight's story was doing arithmetic, slowly, silently, and without any reference to what was being built on top of it. The Dead Sea transform under Aleppo moves at roughly half a centimetre a year. In the 400 years before 1138, that is about 2 metres of accumulated strain, waiting, the Hellenic arc under Crete is converging at several centimetres a year, one of the faster convergence rates in the Mediterranean, which is why that region produces large events more frequently than almost anywhere else in Europe. The Nankai Trough under Kamakura and the Japanese Pacific coast is being subducted at a rate that produces a great earthquake, on average every century or two, which is why the Japanese record contains so many of them, and why the Japanese state watches it the way it does. And the slow ones, the Upper Rhine Graben under Basel, whatever fault lies under Lincolnshire, accumulate at fractions of a millimetre a year, which is why they go centuries or millennia between events, and why nobody expects anything from them at all. Now consider the timescales that human institutions operate on. A building is designed for perhaps a century. A dynasty lasts a few generations. Living memory reaches back maybe 80 years. Written institutional memory in most of the world reaches back a few centuries at best. Even Japan, with the longest continuous record on Earth, has documentation covering a period shorter than the recurrence interval of some of the faults beneath it. So there is a fundamental mismatch. The fault operates on a clock measured in centuries and millennia. The society operates on a clock measured in decades. And what falls into the gap between those two clocks is exactly the thing that killed people in every one of tonight's 6 cities. The assumption that the recent past is a reliable guide to the near future. It is not. It never has been. A place that has not had an earthquake in 300 years is not a safe place. It is a place where the arithmetic has been running uninterrupted for 300 years. That is not a reason to be frightened. Fear is not useful, and I have no interest in producing it. It is a reason to be a specific kind of humble, the kind that says the absence of a memory is not evidence of an absence of risk. Part 30. Closing. So, 6 cities. Aleppo, where the walls came down and the armies moved into the gap. Lincoln, where a cathedral fell in a country that should not have earthquakes and a nation's architecture changed because of it. Crete and Alexandria, where the sea retreated on a summer morning and people walked out onto the harbour floor to look, and the ruins of a wonder of the ancient world finally came down. Friuli, where the mountains came apart in January and the plague arrived in the spring, and the survivors of both went looking for someone to blame. Basel, which felt one shock, went back indoors, felt a second, and then burned for days because every hearth in the city had been tipped into a timber room at the same moment. And Kamakura, where the wave took a temple hall away from around a bronze Buddha, and nobody ever built it back, and the statue has sat under open sky for 500 years since. In every single one, the shaking was the opening, never the whole of it, rarely the worst of it. And the people who survived, did what people always do. They dug, they counted, they buried, they asked why. Some of them found an answer that helped, and some of them found an answer that killed their neighbours. They rebuilt, mostly, because rebuilding is what human beings do on top of faults, over and over, for as long as there has been anywhere worth living. Every one of those cities is still there. The fault under Aleppo is still moving, the Hellenic arc is still converging, the Rhine-Graben is still pulling apart at a fraction of a millimetre a year, quietly, exactly as it was on the 17th of October 1356, and somewhere in Japan tonight. Sensors are sitting on the seafloor above the Nankai Trough in total darkness, listening, because that is the one genuinely new thing our species has managed in 700 years. Not the ability to stop it, not the ability to predict it, just the willingness to keep watching, and to say out loud what we see, and to admit honestly how much of it we still cannot read. The ground under Basel has been silent since 1356. The ground under Lincolnshire has been silent since 1185. The great Buddha has been sitting in the rain since 1498. Silence is not safety. It is just arithmetic that has not finished. That is the story. If you made it all the way here, thank you, genuinely. This one took a long time to research, and I know it was not a short listen. Tell me in the comments which of the 6 hit hardest for you. I suspect it will be Basel, because of that hour, but I have been wrong before. And tell me this too. Is there a disaster from the medieval world you want me to cover next? I have a list, but I would rather build it from what you actually want to hear about. If you found this worthwhile, a like genuinely helps the channel more than you would think, and subscribing means you will not miss the next one. Share it with someone who likes history that does not flatter us. Until then, remember that the ground you are standing on has a history, and that history is longer than anyone's memory of it. Good night, history lovers.